They were opposed to oppression. They were opposed to exploitation. They participated effectively in that quest for independence. But soon after independence, something very strange happened. There was the Cold War. That was the struggle between socialism and capitalism. If you throw back your minds to the past, you realize that Kenya became a British colony protectorate in 1895. In 1920, Kenya became a British colony. What does that mean? That means that the foundation of modern Kenya was characteristically capitalistic. All the years of colonialism were the years that were spent on entrenching and protecting capitalism in Kenya. I'm talking about the major means of production in colonial Kenya, and I'm saying that it was capitalistic in nature. This had tremendous implications for labor. That was the time that seeds of discord between labor and capital were planted. The antagonism between capital and labor that characterized colonial Kenya still characterizes post-colonial Kenya. And most of the struggles that we have waged in the labor sector are struggles against the excesses of capitalism. I am saying that when Kenya attained independence in 1963, Kenya agreed to embrace capitalist mode of production. What does that mean? That means that there would be no democratic space for alternative views, including labor movement. That is why as soon as the government took off in 1963, the first culprits were trade unionists. You will recall that in 1966, a number of trade unionists were arrested and detained without trial. That was neo-colonial Kenya. Neo-colonial Kenya was interested and in fact put a very high premium on capital. So capitalism had to be protected. All institutions, public institutions, were structured in such a way that they had to protect capital at the expense of labor. What does that mean? That means that the government would create laws that would condition people to be more inclined to capital than to labor. That's why between 1960 and 1970, trade unionism was more intense and identified with the ideology of socialism that signified opposition in the country. In 1966, when a number of trade unions were arrested and detained without trial, trade unionism took a back seat to the extent that in 1982, when Kenya became a de jure one-party system, most of the trade unions complied with the state dictates. Some of them were almost incorporated as agencies of one-party authoritarianism. Between 1982 and 1992, when the constitution was repealed to make Kenya a multi-party system, trade unionism had not performed very well. I am saying that between 1963 and 1982, when Kenya became a one-party system, the democratic space had been constricted to the extent that the government did not want to hear alternative voices. This went a long way to entrench capitalism. And don't forget that when Kenya became a capitalist state in 1963, they allowed the re-entrenchment of international finance capital. Our economy has largely remained dependent. In a situation where economy is dependent, trade unions have no room for maneuver. The antagonism between trade labor movements and the government significantly remains antagonistic. The Unionist Commission. You have to follow the guidelines. In the recent times, we negotiated. Before we negotiated, the government allegedly set aside 10 billion for the university staff. Salaries and Remuneration Commission wrote to us and said we should not go beyond 10 billion. We negotiated, completed. Is it not a surprise that that 10 billion is not existent? Is it not a surprise that we are back to square one and we are being told to renegotiate while the CB has been registered in the courts? So what I want to point out here is that one of the greatest obstacles to our contemporary struggles is lack of ideology on the part of trade unions. Are you getting it? The ideological base of trade unionism has been eroded to the extent that most of the trade unions we have cannot claim any philosophy behind them at all. There is total lack of ideology. That is one. The next obstacle that we have to confront are constitutional obstacles. And how to get the judiciary to understand the dynamics and dialectics of labor movement in contemporary times. Because of the disdain of the government and because of constant efforts by the government to weaken the labor movement, some of the trade unions have been incorporated and they are now operating as part and parcel of government agencies. The ones that have resisted, like UASU, like NAT, are considered to be disgruntled elements that are against national development. That's why the government never sees eye to eye with the UASU leadership, neither does it see eye to eye with the NAT leadership. That aside, we also have our own obstacles that we must overcome. Most of the trade unions in this country, especially the ones in the public sector, lack capital base. This has undermined our efforts to train our members, to educate our members, to arouse awareness in our members, and to make our members understand the significance of trade unionism in struggling and protecting the rights and welfare of workers. I also want to point out that because of the unfriendly nature of the judiciary, most of the ILO conventions have not been adequately domesticated. If you look at labor relations, ILO conventions 87, that allows a host of things, you discover that they are rarely respected in our country. And that means that the kind of leeway that other trade unions enjoy elsewhere are yet to be entrenched in our country. It is also important to understand that we have not moved away from orthodox trade unionism to modern trade unionism. And in fact, I am going to propose that until we change the mentality, until we move to a paradigm shift in which trade unionism is science-based and technology-driven, we will not be able to confront some of the challenges emanating from the state. I am saying that because if you go to Germany, Japan, you'll find that the approaches adopted in labor movement there are radically different. In Japan, for instance, more often than not, it is the government that borrows money from the labor movement. something unheard of. But in our situation, even the little we get, sometimes the government ensures that labor movement is starved of union dues. You remember the case of NAT and Coupet? That illustrates all. Back in the universities, whenever we are on strike, the first thing they stop is remittance of union dues. That means that there is a deliberate conspiracy between government agencies and the government to ensure that labor movement retrogresses rather than progresses. But again, there is also one thing that we need to do. One of the greatest challenges we must confront is how to educate the government to understand that labor movement is not a liability, it's an asset, especially if you want to develop an integrated national economy. The role of trade unions in a dynamic national economy cannot be underestimated. When workers, and let me put it this way, when the government talks of productivity, who is supposed to be productive? Do you expect poverty-stricken worker to be productive? Do you expect an hungry worker to be productive? So there is a very significant relationship between productivity and workers' welfare. So it is our duty to educate the government to understand the full ramifications of denying workers their rights, including the right to be creative and productive. I am saying that in a situation where the workers are deprived of their labor value, you cannot expect them to be productive. But because you want to exploit them, because you put a high premium on capital, you believe in ruthless exploitation of the workers. So you must oppress them. You must exploit them in order to protect capital. So this mismatch between capital and labor in our country is a challenge that contemporary trade unions must confront. And I've also pointed out the role of international finance capital. If you want to understand the political economy of international finance capital, come to Kenya. I will tell you this. There's a document circulating in the government, authored by World Bank. The World Bank has advised the government that there should be no negotiations whatsoever between now and 2022. So between now and 2022, the government must orchestrate movements that are calculated to delay meaningful negotiations for the worker. In other words, between now and 2022, exploitation of workers, violation of their rights must continue with abandon. I'm therefore pointing out that contemporary trade unions must know the role of international finance capital, especially the role of World Bank in our economy. The World Bank does not need active trade unionism. And in order to confirm this, you'll also discover that the ministry, the line ministry, that is supposed to handle labor matters in this country is the most understaffed. And if you look at the budgetary allocations for the ministries, go to labor, you will find that the government does not have much respect for the ministry, because the government puts more premium on capital than labor. Therefore, labor ministry must be understaffed. I mean, it must be staffed so that it does not operate to full capacity. Because that ministry is supposed to work with other agencies to provide funds for training workers, to provide funds for strengthening labor institutions. The reason we must face these struggles with the government is that the government is not interested in alternative center of power, because where workers are properly organized, and the history of Zimbabwe is with us, where workers are properly organized, they can also be center of power. So we are saying that the current labor movement must brace for tough times ahead. But as we brace for tough times ahead, we must also go back to our houses and find out the shortcomings of each labor movement, each trade union in our country. Lastly, you realize that we have got 2 labor centers in our country. Go back and find out why we have two labor centers. KOTU, the first labor center, is closely allied to the government. Trade Unions Congress of Kenya is out of that orbit. But we are out of that orbit because we are interested in practically protecting the rights of workers without compromising them. We want labor legislation that is worker-friendly. We want labor administration that is worker-friendly. We want labor movement that recognizes, takes cognizance of international ILO conventions and insists on domesticating them in the best interests of the workers. So the challenges ahead of the labor movement are enormous, and I think we should go back to the drawing board and research how we can make the labor movement science-based, innovative, and technology-oriented. Thank you, and God bless you.